A routine flight between Jakarta and Medan, Indonesia goes horribly wrong. The pilots have inadvertently flown off course and have flown into a region of hills and mountains. Visibility is poor, with the pilots being able to only see a few hundred meters ahead of them. Without any warning of danger, the plane clips the tops of trees and crashes into the Indonesian countryside. Everyone on board the plane was killed in the accident. Just what happened on Garuda Indonesia Flight 152? The day is September 26, 1997. Indonesia's capital, Jakarta, is one of the largest cities in the world. With its population of over 30 million in the Jakarta metro area, the metropolis is served by Soekarno-Hatta International Airport. Again, one of the largest and busiest airports in the world. The airport is the hub of the Indonesian national airline, Garuda Indonesia. Formed in 1947, this airline has a fleet of hundreds of planes including its subsidiaries, and serves destinations to 5 continents. In the 1990s, Garuda Indonesia operated 21 Airbus A300 series planes. The twin-engine widebody is ideal for the domestic Indonesian market given the high demand and size of the country. There were 2 primary passenger variants of the A300, the B2/B4 and 600R variants. Garuda Indonesia operated both types, however it was the B4 specifically that was operating for the airline. The manufacturer, Airbus, considered these 2 types of planes to be different enough that they warrant a separate type rating to fly each plane. The A300-600R has a much more up-to-date flight deck than the previously produced B2 and B4 version of the plane. With its digital displays and glass cockpit, it is much more modern than the analog flight deck of the B2 and 4. The original A300 needed a 3rd flight crew member when it first launched in the 1970s, the flight engineer. Garuda Indonesia's A300-B4s were actually a modified version of the plane. A conversion of the flight deck, called the forward-facing crew concept, made modifications to the flight controls, simplifying them. Of particular interest is that the previously mentioned flight engineer position was eliminated from the flight deck. Instead, all the relevant information and switches would be relocated to the main panel displays and overhead panel, whilst also retaining the analog flight gauges. Garuda Indonesia Flight 152 is preparing for a domestic flight in the late morning to Medan. This particular plane was manufactured in 1982 and has seen over 27,000 flight hours across 16,500 flights. Over the past year prior to September 1997, multiple pilots had reported concerns about the plane to the airline in respect to the plane's autopilot and air conditioning systems. 164 reported problems were reported in the maintenance records. However, in the week leading up to the accident, there were no further problems reported regarding the plane's autopilot. In the months leading up to September 1997, the plane had gone in for an A and C check in maintenance. These checks pay close attention to varying aircraft systems. In both of these checks, the Ground Proximity Warning System, or GPWS for short, is inspected. The Ground Proximity Warning System is a system that warns pilots of imminent conflict with terrain. It is constantly on the lookout for any obstructions in the aircraft's way and will warn the pilots with a very specific series of audible warnings. In the A check, an operational test of the system is performed, and in the C check, its functionality is tested further. Following the crash of Flight 152, the investigation carried out by the Indonesian National Transportation Safety Committee, the NTSC, it was determined that it could not be verified whether the functional check was performed during the last C check. The 2 members of the flight crew on Flight 152 were Captain Hans Wiyogo, aged 41, and First Officer Tata Zualdi, who was of the same age. Captain Wiyogo has served on the A300 for many years, having flown both variants of the A300. He passed his training to captain the A300-B4 just 11 months earlier. First Officer Zualdi has also long served for Garuda, having been a co-pilot on the DC-10 and Boeing 747. However, he has only been flying the A300 since June 1996. Garuda Indonesia Flight 152 departed Jakarta at 11:41 am. The country of Indonesia is a large archipelago of islands. The capital and departure city of Flight 152, Jakarta, is located on the island of Java. Flight 152's destination is Medan International Airport in the city of Medan, which is located on just the next island over in Sumatra. Before departure, the crew of Flight 152 reported to their airline's flight operations office to receive a briefing on the flight. Flight crew often check for Notice to Airmen notices, or NOTAMs for short. These are pieces of information that are given to pilots to take into consideration for their flight. In this instance, the crew of Flight 152 are informed that some of the navigational equipment in Medan is listed as restricted because of a heading alignment issue. The navigational aid in question was the Medan VOR. The crew are told to use this equipment with caution. Also in the NOTAMs, it is noted that as part of the weather conditions, the pilots are notified that forest fires in Central and South Sumatra have substantially reduced visibility in Northern Sumatra. Meteorological conditions on the day of the incident report that while winds were light and the clouds scattered, there was smoke in the area and visibility was down to between 400 and 500 meters. Smoke is indicated in the METEOR recordings as FU. Medan's Medan Airport operates with a single runway marked runway 23 and 05. The airport uses reciprocal runway operations. Because the apron is located at the end close to runway 23, and there is no parallel taxiway that runs the full length of the runway, runway 23 is preferred for takeoff, while runway 05 is preferred for landing. Conditions allowed the airport to use both directions at the same time. During the right weather conditions, this operation of the runway is considered safe. However, this would be brought into question given the visibility conditions on the day of the incident. The air traffic controller on duty at the airport had decided to open both directions to avoid delays in takeoff and landing. The controller gives Flight 152 their approach clearance, to which the crew had accepted 42 nautical miles from the airport. The plane is cleared to descend to 3,000 feet. The captain had mentioned while passing through 10,000 feet to the co-pilot that they may encounter smoke from the forest fires. Garuda Indonesia Flight 152 is approaching Medan from the southeast. The plan by the controller is to vector the plane parallel to runway 23 before turning it right for final approach onto runway 05. Once the A300 is at 3,000 feet, the controller gives the flight crew a new instruction. To quote as was said by the controller, Merpati 152, turn left heading 240 vectoring for intercept ILS runway 05. What is very peculiar about this transmission is this first word, Merpati. Merpati is another Indonesian airline. Every airline has a distinct call sign to help identify their planes. The call sign for Garuda Indonesia Airlines is Indonesia, not Merpati. As such, the crew did not respond to this message thinking it wasn't for them, when the controller had mistaken the plane's call sign. This message was intended for Garuda Indonesia Flight 152. There was a Merpati flight earlier that day into the airport with the same 152 flight number. The two flights with the same flight number but different call sign may have caused the controller to mistakenly say Merpati instead of Indonesia. A few moments pass without the controller getting an acknowledgement from the plane, to which they then transmit, Indonesia 152, do you read? This time with the correct call sign. Flight 152 responds with a standard message to repeat the last transmission. Indonesia 152, say again. The Medan Airport controller then relays the message again as, OK, turn left heading 240-235 now vectoring for ILS runway 05. This time, omitting the instruction to intercept the ILS. As discussed in a previous video, an ILS is a piece of aviation equipment which sends out horizontal and vertical information to an aeroplane. This information can be displayed even on analog displays, to help pilots guide their plane to the foot of the runway. Oftentimes these can be flown by the autopilots. Following the directions given by the ILS along a glide slope descent path, this technology can make flying in low visibility much more manageable. In this case, the radar vectoring section of the approach is supposed to end when the plane begins to intercept the ILS. Captain Wiyogo then has doubts about his position, and takes over radio communication from First Officer Zuwaldi. He then directly asks the controller for confirmation on his heading and whether he will be clear of the mountainous terrain to which he is familiar with. To the south of Medan is a large hilled and mountainous area. Captain Wiyogo's knowledge of the terrain prompted him to directly make the call to the tower himself. According to the airline's basic operations manual, it is stated that if there is any doubts in the approach and with no time or opportunity to study the charts, the clearance and approach should not be accepted, meaning that the flight crew at this moment should have abandoned their approach and attempted the approach again. The flight crew on Flight 152, however, continued their approach and began turning to the left to make for the heading that they were instructed to make and begin configuring their plane for landing. They are now flying parallel with the runway at Medan. One more turn to the right will bring them on course for final onto the runway. Another plane at Medan Airport prepares for departure in the opposite direction. It is cleared for takeoff and turns away from the airport to give Flight 152 a clear path to the runway. According to the captain's approach charts, the standard approach into Medan from their position involved them flying over the airport to arrive from the north. The controller, however, never mentioned that they were actually approaching from the south, but still vectored the plane to reflect that. The instruction was then received from the controller, Indonesia 152, turn right, heading 046. With this instruction, the plane should have turned to the right, lining up for the runway to intercept the ILS. Instead, the captain, perhaps from looking at his charts thinking he was north of the airport, started turning left. A distraction in the flight deck relating to the plane's air conditioning caused the first officer to not notice at first that the plane was turning left instead of right, as per the controller's instructions. The plane had now descended to 2,000 feet and descending further. They are now further south than they should be. Flight 152 is flying into the hilled Indonesian countryside. Within the last minute before the crash, the controller tries to confirm the direction that the crew are taking with the transmission of 152, confirm you are making a left turn now? To which Flight 152 then responded that they were now correct in their approach and turning right. The low visibility from the forest fire's smoke means that neither pilot can see the treetops just in front of them. Under normal circumstances, the previously discussed ground proximity warning system should have alerted the pilots that they were dangerously close to terrain. After the incident, after poring over the cockpit voice recording, it was determined by the investigation that the audio warnings normally associated with the ground proximity warning system did not sound in the flight deck. The system was not properly checked during the plane's last sea check. Here is what the pilots should have heard in these moments.
All up. All up.
Had the ground proximity warning system been working correctly and sounded in the flight deck as it should have, the pilots may have been able to make the maneuvers needed to avoid the collision with the ground. The airline's aircraft operations manual states that in the event of a ground proximity warning system alert, the pilots must disconnect the autopilot, apply go-around thrust, and attain an appropriate climbing angle of attack. At just after 1:30 p.m. on September 26, 1997, Garuda Indonesia Flight 152 crashed after the plane's wings clipped the tops of the trees. The damage caused by the impact with the trees left the aircraft uncontrollable. For 10 seconds, the pilots struggled to keep their plane from going down. The resulting crash killed all 234 people on board. As quoted in the official report by the Indonesian National Transportation Safety Committee as for the probable cause of the accident, there was confusion regarding the turning direction of left instead of right at the critical position during vectoring that reduced the flight crew's vertical awareness while they were concentrating on the aircraft's lateral changes. These caused the aircraft to continue descending below the assigned altitude of 2,000 feet and hit the treetops at 1,550 feet. The air traffic controller situation at Medan Airport was also looked at. The air traffic controller on duty did not update the plane with position updates, even when the plane left the airport's vectoring boundaries. The investigation believed that the controller's workload may have impeded their performance. The same flight number used for two different planes on the same day was also listed as a safety hazard. Recommendations were also given to the airport itself. An extension to allow for a taxiway to run the full length of the runway was recommended, however this recommendation was ignored, as the airport layout remains unchanged to this day. The airport itself was replaced in 2013, once a more modern airport was built away from the city. This old airport now primarily serves general aviation and military activities. Recommendations to the airline included the enforcement of already existing standard operating procedures and to ensure that the correct functionality checks are performed on their ground proximity warning system so they are up to a satisfactory standard. Garuda Indonesia retired the Airbus A300 in 1999 and replaced them with the more modern Airbus A330. Indonesia's aviation safety record remains to be questionable to this day. Fatal accidents are a common occurrence in the country compared to other nations. Strings of incidents have led to bans of Indonesian airlines from operating in certain parts of the world. In the years between 2007 and 2009, the European Union, with support of the international aviation industry, had banned all Indonesian airlines, including Garuda Indonesia, from flying in Europe. Though this ban has since been lifted, the record of aviation safety in the country remains concerning to this day. I would just like to once again thank my patrons for their ongoing support. If you want to get your name featured here at the end of the next video or would like your name read out, you can join my Patreon from just £3 per month, and you'll also get videos 48 hours before anyone else. Link will be provided in the pinned comment. So a thank you to my £5 patrons, KTP123, Marie Ennis, and Side Effect. Thank you so much. And once again, a very big special thanks to my £10 patron, Cherub. You're too kind. Thank you so much for your support, as always. And that's it from me this week. The next video will be out next Saturday, but if you want to catch it 48 hours before anyone else on Thursday, you can always join the Patreon. Thanks, and have a great weekend. Take care.